Hello, everyone. My name is Todd Green, and I'm the Executive Director of WorkRise, a research to action network on jobs, workers, and mobility hosted by the Urban Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar on our open request for proposals. This RFP, which you'll learn more about today, is focused exclusively on funding pilot studies of real-world interventions that boost upward economic mobility for workers earning lower wages. First, I'll get off to a few housekeeping items and get that out of the way. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterward. All participants are muted, but you can send questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. So before we get into, next slide, please. Before we get into the details of the RFP, I'll provide a bit more background on WorkRise, which officially launched just 2 years ago and is rooted in previous Urban Institute initiatives on economic mobility. WorkRise's mission is to build a more equitable and resilient labor market that strengthens economic security and expands economic opportunity mobility for low and middle wage workers. We also aim to fully understand and dismantle structural inequities such as racial and gender discrimination and occupational segregation so all workers can reach their full potential. Now, we pursue our mission by funding both research that helps us better diagnose or define fundamental challenges to mobility in the labor market, as well as pilot studies that test innovative solutions to overcome those challenges. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are a research to action network, which means our work does not end with the production of new evidence and knowledge. We aim to drive policy and practice change through research, and we do this through activating our stakeholder network of employers, worker advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and funders through dialogue, engagement, convenings, and through outreach. Next slide. Now, this slide provides a good overview of our theory of change. We define our central challenge as declining economic security and mobility for low and middle wage workers. Among our stakeholder networks, there are divergent views on the root cause of the problem and really a lot of siloed and piecemeal solutions. Our approach represents a combination of investing in research, testing solutions, and communicating our results with stakeholders in key positions to act upon the evidence. Now, we define our outcomes as not only generating new evidence to inform decision-making, but also building consensus around new pathways for economic mobility now and also in the future. Next, our stakeholders play an essential role in not only sharing and acting upon the evidence we build through research investments, but also in helping us to define what our research priorities should be. Now, this slide illustrates how we engage employers, policymakers, advocates, and practitioners in an iterative process. It starts with seeking their input on the key research questions we should pursue. Now, these questions, they ultimately form the building blocks of our research agenda, which we advance through investments in both commissioned and competitive RFP-driven research, like what you'll hear about later today. We then move our research to action through engagement, outreach, and communications, and the cycle starts all over again. Next, we've created a structure to organize our research agenda, and this slide shares information about our key research pillars, or what we consider to be the main levers driving mobility in the labor market. And these are macroeconomic and labor market policies and context, employer practices, worker power and worker voice, search and matching frictions and opportunities in the labor market, skills and training, and then also the social determinants of work. Next, finally, we'd like to share more information about our collaborative funder network. Our founding funders are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. For this funding opportunity focused on pilots, the Center for Inclusive Growth at MasterCard provided additional input and support, which we're so grateful for. We thank all of our funders listed here for supporting this RFP and all other work. And with that, I'll pass this along to my colleague, Caleb Quackenbush, who will dive more into the details about this RFP. Caleb.
Thank you, Todd. Greetings, everyone. I'm Caleb Quackenbush. I'm a policy program manager at the Urban Institute, and I help manage grant making for WorkRise. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So we're excited to launch our third request for proposals. So this RFP is actually a little bit different from our first two in that our funding will be focused exclusively on pilot projects, which we are defining as partnerships between researchers and public, private, or nonprofit organizations that are implementing relatively novel interventions aimed at improving outcomes for workers, especially workers that are in low-wage employment. So WorkRise will primarily fund the research and evaluation component of projects. So that's activities that advance the field's understanding and create public goods about what the intervention does, its impact on work and workers, and its viability for scale or further development. Our total award pool for this round of funding is $2.5 million. And we anticipate that most projects that are funded through this opportunity will have budgets between $100,000 and $500,000, although we will consider projects with both higher and lower budgets than that. This RFP is open to institutions, to all institutions and researchers, though we strongly encourage proposals that are from diverse scholars and practitioners and diverse institutions such as HBCUs, tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and minority-led businesses and nonprofits. We encourage teams that are applying from relatively well-resourced organizations to partner with organizations that are either under-resourced or traditionally underrepresented in the field. Next slide. So my colleague Bridget will share a little bit more later about the mechanics of how to apply. But before that, I just want to share a little bit more detail about what constitutes an eligible project and then our specific funding priorities. So here's a little bit more detail about kind of what we consider eligible projects. So this, as I mentioned, is focused on pilot interventions or pilot studies. So number one, there needs to be a research team that is in charge of activities such as data collection, analysis, producing findings, and that will be the primary recipient of WorkRise grant funds. This can be an in-house research unit that's attached to the organization that's actually carrying out the intervention, or it can be a partnering research institution or academic, such as a university or a think tank. In either case, the research team should be able to independently publish results in ways that are credible and transparent to external audiences, regardless of whether the pilot yielded positive findings. So even if the pilot doesn't yield what we expected, that's important knowledge that we want to be able to share with the field and to be able to learn from. Second, there should be a real-world intervention that's being tested in a setting that directly affects people who are either in employment or who are seeking employment. So that can be at an employer, it can be a worker center or advocacy organization, it can be a government agency, or it can be a collaboration of any of those types of organizations. And the intervention doesn't have to be brand new, although it should be relatively new and it should be considered relatively understudied or not well understood in the field. So the combination of the research team and a real world intervention is what WorkRise for this RFP is defining as a pilot. The pilot's research design should produce new data that improves our understanding of whether, how, and for whom an innovation influences outcomes related to economic mobility for workers. And it should also shed light on the intervention's potential or readiness for scale or reproduction in other contexts and settings. So if you have a research idea that is not a pilot, but it does pertain to worker economic mobility, just know that there will be future funding opportunities through WorkRise. So stay tuned for those, subscribe to WorkRise's newsletters and stay in touch with us to be aware when those launch. Next slide. So these next two slides describe our funding priorities to explain what WorkRise is specifically interested in supporting and studying. So first are sort of the topics or thematic areas that we are most focused on. And those include interventions that are leveraging technology, data science, machine learning in novel ways, interventions that are fostering economic mobility for workers, particularly those that are employed in small and medium-sized enterprises, in addition to workers in larger employers. We want to see proposals that address interventions that create pathways into higher wage industries outside of the traditional degree attainment track, interventions that provide training and employment opportunities for workers that are in industries that are at risk of displacement, either due to automation or other economic disruption, interventions that close gaps in knowledge or access to digital skills and tools for workers, and finally, interventions that bolster economic security that are embedded in employment and training contexts. So next slide. And now here are some of the outcomes that we're most focused on. So your project might address other outcomes as well, and we're very flexible in terms of how outcomes are specifically defined and measured, whether qualitatively or quantitatively. But we'd like to see proposals that describe how the study will just demonstrate the intervention's influence on wages or earning potential, broader financial health outcomes. So that's improved ability to manage daily finances, to be resilient to economic shocks, and to confidently plan for the future. Interventions that create improvements to job quality or access to quality job that provide benefits beyond just a livable wage. Relatedly, we'd like to see proposals that encourage increased representation and voice of workers over their tasks and their working conditions. And more broadly, we'd love to see proposals that have interventions that remove or mitigate structural barriers like discrimination or inequality. Next slide. So we lay out in much more detail what activities are supported in the full RFP, but just at a high level, we want prospective applicants to know that WorkRise's primary interest is in increasing the knowledge of policymakers, practitioners, and the research community about the evidence behind solutions that propel economic mobility for workers. Given our grant-making horizon, so thinking about projects that span maybe between 6 months and 2 years, we're biased towards projects that produce findings in the near term, even if those are interim findings. So therefore, we cannot support product development or stand up a new organization. We just don't have the grant funds or the time horizon to do that. So interventions should generally be able to stand on their own without significant support from WorkRise. And we encourage applicants to leverage funding from other funding sources that they have. That said, we want to encourage and ensure that those operating the intervention itself have sufficient incentive to participate. So if you have specific questions about what WorkRise funds can and cannot support, I strongly encourage that you reach out with those specific questions to the WorkRise email address. So that's workrise@urban.org, and we'll give that, I think, on one of the last slides as well, and it's on our website. Next slide. I think this is the last one from me. This RFP will take place in 2 stages. So the first stage that we're describing today, we're collecting letters of inquiry from projects and kind of understanding what this is about. And they will be, those LOIs will be evaluated against the criteria that are shown here. So first, it should be relevant to the topics and priorities described in the RFP. It should actually be a pilot as we've described and defined it. Second, it should be a fairly rigorous study. So the LOI should describe a well-defined set of research questions and an approach to answering them through studying the intervention. So it doesn't have to be an elaborate randomized controlled trial, but it should adhere to sound research practices relative to its field of study and to the stage of the intervention. And finally, the study should produce evidence that meaningfully removes knowledge barriers that are impeding change in your field of practice. So in other words, it should address questions that are being raised not just by researchers, but also by policymakers, businesses, or other key stakeholders about whether something works and whether it's viable in specific contexts and what to do next. So projects that engage workers directly or the communities that are affected, we believe are the ones that are going to be best positioned to create this kind of change. So WorkRise, our peer reviewers and our leadership board will apply these criteria to select a subset of finalists to more fully scope out their projects for consideration for WorkRise funding. So once again, I encourage you to visit the WorkRise website for more details about the RFP, and there's a broader FAQ there in addition to the questions that we'll answer today. But before you do that, I hope you'll listen to Bridget coming up next to walk you through how to actually submit your application.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Caleb. I'm Bridget Valson, the project manager for WorkRise, overseeing our business operations. I'm going to share some guidance with you all on how to complete and submit your LOI application. And I'll also demo our application for you in real time in just a few minutes. Next slide. Before you start your application, we strongly encourage applicants to read the RFP materials available on the WorkRise website and prepare your submission in advance. You should refer to the project narrative requirements and budget guidance to prepare documents you will need to upload, and you can preview the application form fields in the online application portal guidance. Next slide. LOIs must be submitted through the WorkRise grant portal, which can be accessed at urbaninstitute.force.com. Please keep in mind that we will not accept LOI applications submitted via email. Next slide. Once you're ready to start your application, you'll need to create an account. The applicant is the primary organization that will be overseeing the management or administration of the grant if awarded. If you've previously applied to WorkRise, you can apply again using your existing account. If this is your first time applying, you will need to create an account. Next slide. The application itself is a simple 3-step process. First, you'll complete and save the LOI form. Next, you'll upload the required documents, and then you're ready to submit. Now I'll begin the demo. Am I good to go? Okay. When you arrive at the urbaninstitute.force.com, you're greeted by a login page. If you are a new applicant, you can create an account. And if you have an existing account, you can recover your password, or you can go ahead and log in. Sorry about this. Not sure why it's not going. There we go. My apologies. On the grant portal homepage, there are links to resources you can reference when preparing to submit your LOI. And to get started on your application, go ahead and click on the request for proposals link at the top of the navigation bar. On the About This Funding Opportunity tab, you can scroll down to select the orange Apply button. You can review the eligibility criteria to ensure that your organization is eligible to apply, and then click Next. Once the application form opens, you'll be prompted to begin filling in the required fields. The information icon provides more information about what's required in each field. There are also notes about certain fields that provide additional guidance. The form contains several pick lists where you will be selecting one or more options as they are relevant to your proposed project. To select more than one option, you can hold down the Control or Command key on your keyboard and click on All that apply. The LOI application form must be completed in a single session. If responses are prepared in advance, the form can be completed in less than 10 minutes. You will have an opportunity to review and edit your responses once the application form is saved. You do not have to submit your LOI application until you are ready. Once the application form is saved, you can continue to edit your responses and upload documents until the RFP deadline. To upload the required documents, you can click on Upload Files, drag and drop files, or you can select the drop-down arrow and select Add Files. To edit a form field in the LOI, you can click on the pencil icon and then save your changes. To submit your application, scroll down to the bottom of the form and select Submit Application. Once your LOI is submitted, it cannot be edited. Finally, to check on the status of your application, once it has been submitted, click on the Request for Proposals link, click on the My Applications tab, and you can check on the status of your LOI. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Caleb.
Thanks. So if we can pull the slides back up, I think we have just a timeline for RFP decisions. There we go. So next slide, next one. There we are. All right, thanks for tuning in and getting all that information. I know it's a lot. We'll have a recording of this, by the way, on the events, the webinar events page after this presentation later today. So I just want to highlight some key dates for this RFP. The most important one being April 8th, which is when LOI submissions are due through the application process that Bridget just described by 6 o'clock Eastern time. So late May, early June is when we will be reaching out to finalists to submit full proposals. So that's after the WorkRise team and our peer reviewers and our leadership board have had the time to take in the full set of LOIs that we've had and evaluate them against the criteria that we laid out, and then identify the ones that have the most alignment with our priorities and most potential for impact. We'll work with those teams over the summer to craft their full proposals. And so, it might be a subset of what they originally proposed, or thinking through, better ways to refine those research questions. And full proposals will be due middle of the summer, around mid-July. And by around Labor Day is when we anticipate making a public announcement. So ahead of that is when we'll make award notifications to applicants who are selected for full funding. So with that, I think next slide is just a little bit more information. So this is where we'll dive into our audience Q&A. And I invite my colleagues to turn their video on because we'll be fielding this. I will answer several of these questions best I can, but I encourage others to weigh in with their thoughts as well. So I'll take an easy one first. Does the pilot have to address all of the funding priorities that you listed? And the answer is no. It can be just a subset, because we know that there's no one single purpose intervention that's going to address all of these. So just be very clear, and I think that you'll see very transparently in our LOI flow in the application portal. You'll be able to select which of these topics and themes your proposal specifically addresses, and obviously you'll have a chance to describe them in more detail in your LOI as well. We also have a question, is there a preferred methodology for proposals? And the answer is no, not specifically. As I mentioned, it should kind of adhere to fairly rigorous standards in its field of study and for the stage of the intervention. So RCTs are great, but we understand that not every project or budget will fit that. But to the extent that we can walk away with a clear understanding of what we do and don't understand from a specific research project, what questions are answered and what questions are kind of left unanswered or worth further exploration, I believe is kind of what we're going for in terms of the research design. The next question is the research, should the research team, put this more clearly, the research team must be the lead applicant. For example, if you have a community-based organization, does the research institution have to be the lead applicant? And I believe the answer there is no, although since we're primarily funding research activities, it generally makes sense for the research institution to be the lead funder. And just in terms of how our awards are structured, I think it also makes more sense. But I'm going to pause there and let either Bridget or Todd weigh in if you have additional thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely, I'll add to what Caleb just said, in that we certainly encourage applications from community-based organizations and other organizations that may not be a research-based organization. So I want to make sure that that we encourage that. And I would also recommend that you have a research partner. Caleb talked about there are lots of local-based universities or other types of organizations that also provide research support that you may want to partner with to help you to formulate your research questions and to actually undertake the research. So definitely, we'd love to receive all sorts of applications as long as it's grounded in research.
Thank you. And then I actually have another fun question for you, Todd. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by relatively new? So I think sort of the general question is how novel does the intervention need to be in order to be considered eligible for this?
That's also a great question. And WorkRise really primarily seeks to develop new knowledge and to expand that knowledge. However, new could mean something that might be existing, but perhaps reframed into a new context. Working on the target might be a different population set. It may be a different type of intervention. So I think we're subjective about what that word new means. And so well, please feel free to write into us with a specific question if you'd like to know more about your project. But certainly we don't want to receive applications that are merely tests or pilots of programs or interventions that we know have already, that there's a fair amount of evidence or research around already.
Todd, the next question is, if the proposal is studying an existing program, but with a new intervention arm to supplement the existing program, can funding be used to cover the additive costs of that new sort of intervention arm in addition to the research activities? And I think our general answer to that is within reason, yes. I think we're when we're evaluating proposals, we want to, there is sort of a cost-benefit trade-off. So as long as, if you're providing incentives or additional data collection needs and those kinds of activities that are just associated with the new treatment arm, I think by all means, those can be included in the budget as well. The next question, can you speak a little bit more about future RFPs, and will future RFPs focused on interventions like retirement savings incentives or things that maybe aren't covered by this specific RFP? So I think what I'll say there is a lot of that planning is still underway. I think we'll be releasing a new sort of general research call funding opportunity in the second half of this year, and there will be additional RFPs that are coming in future years. But I don't think we can say too much beyond just the priorities that are identified on the WorkRise website and some of the research that's coming out around just give a little bit of preview. We have some working groups that are focused on specific areas, and those are surfacing high value questions in the field. So stay tuned as those make their way onto our website to get a feel for what we'll be prioritizing in the future. Question, can the research team be comprised of individuals from multiple institutions? And the answer is yes. I think just be very clear about who the research team is, and then in your application budget, kind of break out, what the different contributions from organizations are in the budget. And I'll pause there in case someone wants to weigh in from my team. Yep. All right. Here's a tricky one. Can the employer partners be anonymized in the publication of the findings? Todd, do you have thoughts there? Because I know this is a tricky question.
Yeah, I do, and I would say that yes, they can be, but I also know that it's our intention to uplift evidence and to be able to speak about this research so that it does have an impact on the policy and practice field. So to the extent that that this anonymization inhibits that, then I think that we'll have to consider that. So I wouldn't say that that's a feature that will exclude an application. I just would encourage you to think about as the intent of this is to influence and to inform and impact the field. And to the extent that we have the types of information to be able to do that, I think that's really important.
Next question is, can the research measure results from past and current interventions for comparison and to measure results over time for multiple interventions? So if I'm understanding this question correctly, I believe the answer is yes, provided that it is sort of providing context for the evaluation or study of an intervention that's active. So we are supporting sort of the broader research and reporting. And so if there's some additional kind of study or analysis of related interventions and putting the one that's being, sort of the primary intervention being studied within the context of what's happening more broadly in the field, I think that would be a value add. But I think the bottom line is that there needs to be a specific sort of intervention partner that's operating in the field, and the focus of the research should be on that active intervention. The next question is if our pilot LOI application should come from the research institution rather than the nonprofit partner, can you confirm that this is accurate? So the project team should work together on their LOI. So we expect there will be some back and forth that we don't see between the teams, but we should only receive one LOI. And that LOI should come from the organization that will receive WorkRise funds and manage them. So if there's one organization that's going to receive the WorkRise grant and then disperse them to other partners, that should be the organization from which we receive the LOI and all the application materials. Hope that answers your question. Is there a PDF version of the LOI question so that we can preview it? Yep, that's available just on the WorkRise RFP webpage. As a nonprofit organization, are we required to have a research partner identified at the LOI stage? I believe the answer is we strongly encourage it, although we understand that some organizations might need a little bit more time to find research partners. But I'm going to pause there and let my colleagues weigh in.
We recognize that some organizations may not have quick access to research partners. And so I would encourage you to formulate your research question and submit an LOI to the extent that you can. Certainly there isn't any guarantee that we can partner or suggest a partner for you, but perhaps upon the time in which we've received the LOI, there may be opportunities for us to consider your application now or in the future.
So there's a question that says, what are the required documents? And I think somebody dropped in the chat, there's the actual kind of application portal, but I'm hoping someone can also just drop in for participants the RFP webpage itself. And you'll see there's a little, kind of brief description up front of what the RFP is about. And then there's a set of links to the actual documents themselves that are required. So there's the full kind of RFP that lays out, our priorities in more detail. There's an FAQ that answers questions that we've received from past RFPs that are relevant to this one. And then there's a set of documents that include the fields that you'll click, check the boxes or provide contact information on our application portal, and then the template for your letter of inquiry. So it's about a 5-page write-up of your actual study, and then the template for or guidance for creating a budget to also upload into the application portal. So that's all there. So yeah, just answered that next question as well. All those templates are there. And then when do we need a commitment from industry partners for the LOI or for the full proposal? I would say your application will be most compelling if you already have your industry partners lined up at the LOI stage. But I'll pause there just in case. Yep.
That's
right. Nods. What is the minimum number of workers who should be impacted by an intervention and firms that should be involved? I don't think there is a minimum per se. I think it's more just being able to rigorously define, okay, what's your sample size and what can we say with this sample size, on a sound empirical basis. I think that's should generally be laid out in the research design that you're proposing. So we don't set, kind of a firm minimum or maximum, but obviously we want to be thinking about, the applicability of the intervention, not just within one single organization, but within a wider industry or within a wider context, and its application, especially to workers that are, typically in more vulnerable populations or typically more underserved in the labor market. Next question is, can a research institution submit more than one LOI? The answer is yes. We generally will accept multiple proposals from the same institution. However, they should be for separate proposals, separate projects, basically. So probably not variant 1A, 1B, 1C, but project 1, project 2. And just know that depending on the relevance, we generally will probably only advance one of them. We generally probably won't make grants to the same organization because we want to engage a variety of stakeholders and organizations through our grant making. Will you please repeat the preferred organizational budget? So I mentioned our kind of typical range for projects is between $100,000 and $500,000, but we're open to higher and lower as well. I think the most important criteria is, sort of the cost benefit analysis, the value of the research findings relative to the budget that's being laid out. A question here, are youth in high school preparing to transition into the workforce an eligible population? I believe young adults in general, high school, it's a little trickier, but I think so. Todd, do you want to wait? Yeah.
Agreed. Yes.
Yeah. So it should be, work focused. It's not, like college attainment, but actual, work and worker economic mobility, I think are the main considerations there. If the award notifications come in the fall, what is a reasonable pilot start date? I would say beginning of 2023, so January. Ideally, we would be able to turn around awards faster than that, but I think first quarter of 2023 is reasonable. And I think sort of the default should be, January 1, 2023. I'll pause there in case there are other thoughts. And we can, by the way, if it needs to start a little bit later in the year for, due to timing considerations of the project, I think we're open to that. Getting nods, so I'll move on. Can individual researchers submit an LOI and then select partners? I don't think so. So one, I think WorkRise typically makes grants to organizations, not to individuals. And then secondly, I think in terms of the design of the project itself, there should be a very clear interventions that's being tested, and that implies that there's already kind of a practitioner partner that is there. Now, if there's sort of like auxiliary activities around communication or conducting surveys, I think that can come a little bit later. But I think most of your partners should be lined up fairly early on in the application process. Next question is, how many applicants do you typically have versus finalists and awardees? So how competitive is this likely to be? And the answer is these tend to be very competitive. So just to give you a little insight, we received close to 200 applications on average for our last 2 RFPs. And then I think we're thinking around 10 to 20 finalists, I think closer to 10. And then depending on kind of the span of awards, I can't really say how many full projects will be funded. I think our first RFP, we funded 9. And then last year it was, we had kind of about 10 or 11 like fully funded projects. And then we had a handful of smaller awards that were made, about 10 to 20. But I don't know that given just the pilot nature of this, we'll do those smaller awards. So I would say somewhere in the category of like 10 to 15.
Caleb, if I may just jump in here, even though it's highly competitive, I don't want that to discourage you from submitting a strong LOI. You'll also note that on the form itself, there is a button that will ask you if you are willing to allow to have for your project to be shared with our funder partners. So there may be cases in which we, WorkRise, may not be able to fund a project. However, if it's compelling, we are part of a network of funders who have interest in other types of projects. And there's no promises or guarantees, but certainly if we identify a project that's compelling and for whatever reason, if we're not able to support it through our own grant making at WorkRise, we certainly will look for opportunities for that to be supported elsewhere.
Thank you, Todd. That's actually very helpful. Yes, we want to lift up good work, even if we can't fund it ourselves. But yes, the next question is just how is the full proposal different than the LOI? And the answer there is basically it will be a little bit more detailed. So the LOI is to give us a flavor of what your project is about and what it addresses, and to get a sense of whether the team and the research design is set up to answer the questions that it lays out. And then the full proposal is really to work with teams to say, we need a little bit more detail on this specific question or this specific approach, or in some cases, it can be a question of, I don't think we can fully fund the full budget that you have, but here's a collection of activities that we're specifically interested in. And we would invite you to consider, we would obviously, not just dictate, but we'd invite some back and forth to consider a proposal that addresses that, kind of smaller subset, or maybe even tacks on an additional question as well. So
if I may also add that the LOI is, and I think Bridget said this, but I want to underscore this. We've attempted to make this as simple as possible for you. So we don't want it to be overly burdensome, and I don't think that you'll find it that way. But of course, it is sufficiently rigorous enough for us to be able to obtain the information that will be needed for us to make at least some preliminary funding decisions. So I hope that that you will view it that way. And as Caleb indicated, the stage 2 part of that process is quite a bit more detail, as you would imagine.
So one more question. So I'm going to try to keep an eye on time at the same time here, but we have a few more minutes. are workforce development programs targeting youth eligible? And I believe the answer there is yes. We're in the first year of our pilot program. Would this be of interest to WorkRise? I'd say yes, if it addresses our criteria, and you can line up a research study that sheds some light on the impact of the intervention. By all means, we'd encourage your application. Can the pilot include time to user test an intervention before launching it, or is WorkRise only meant to fund interventions that have been user tested and are ready to launch from day one? I think, and I'll let my colleagues weigh in here. I believe the answer is, well, I'll back up a little bit and say, a typical WorkRise grant, it would span between 6 months to about 24 months. There's a little give or take on either side of that. And so just think about that, in the design of your project. But if there's some, upfront user testing, but there's definitely going to be something that launches within that window and you can have full findings on, I think, yes, we would be able to entertain that. Can this funding be applied to an existing project with seed funding and an institutional partner established? Yes, it can be. We encourage people to leverage funding from other sources. I think the one question is we do want to make sure that WorkRise marginal dollars are having impact. So just defining what those activities and what WorkRise grants are actually supporting as part of that larger body of work is. I think that that's the main consideration for that. Let's see. Preferred duration is we don't have a preferred duration. I think it's more subjective to what makes sense for the project design. And then, but like I said, somewhere between 6 to 24. And if your project is on the longer end, we say this a little bit more in the RFP itself, but we do encourage projects that produce interim results along the way, so that projects aren't just completely backloaded. We'll know in 2 years everything. I think we want to learn together, and so to the extent that you can have interim findings and just keep our stakeholders updated on what you're learning at each stage of the project, that's going to be very valuable to the field. Is there an estimated date for when opportunities will be, future opportunities will be announced? I think I mentioned very briefly earlier, we don't have an exact date, but second half of this year, we're going to get through this RFP and then we're going to, we'll dive into the next one. A maximum award size, specific grant amount, or percentage budget eligible for funding. So we don't have, well, beyond just, $2.5 million is what this total round of funding will be. It's very unlikely that we'll fund something at $2.5 million. I think we want to be able to distribute our research investments across a variety of projects and questions. So as I mentioned, probably 500,000 is kind of a knock it out of the park. Like, this is a super high priority for the field. Our leadership board and everyone is aligned on it. But we'll consider kind of a variety around that span of budgets. Pausing there just in case colleagues want to weigh in.
Great.
All right. Project plan relates to a program that is already running. Could it qualify? Specifically finding a way to capture data and improve on practices that are relevant to the funding opportunities. So yes, I think as we described, we are more than open to evaluations of programs that are already up and running, but are just sort of relatively new and not well understood yet by the research field. Mixed methods or community-based research encouraged. Are you looking for a strict design? Yes, we do encourage projects that are engaging communities, that are incorporating the voices of people who are actually affected by the intervention. So yes, we do encourage that. Will grant cover training costs to help underserved demographics get training and certification if it aligns to an employer who wants to hire them directly? I'm not sure I completely understand this question. But I'll just reiterate that we're primarily funding research activities. I think if there are some marginal project costs that are associated with running the evaluation, WorkRise can cover that. But if you have a more specific question kind of within the context of your project and want to share more with us, I'd encourage you to just reach out to us by email, and we can address that offline. Would an application from a community-based organization that subcontracts with a researcher be viewed in general less favorably than an application where the research partner is the lead? No, I think either case, whatever works best for your project. If the entity that is deploying the intervention is a university or institute, I'd say if it relates to work and workers and addresses people who are either in or seeking employment, yes, we're open to that. Can it be for-profit businesses and ventures? Yes, as well. I think just reiterating that we are, as an initiative, focused on creating public goods, that we're interested in funding research that is independent and objective. So as long as you feel comfortable with a project within those criteria, then by all means, yes, we'd be welcome to it. Can you share contact information for research firms that are available for partnership? If so, there's an organization that's willing to partner. So I'll pause there. I know there are some resources out there online where there are kind of collections of researchers that are interested in partnering with teams. Todd, did you want to say anything more?
I would just encourage, I know in the community, in all communities, there are research partnerships either at universities, at local colleges, community colleges, and in many cases, there are research arms that may not be affiliated with the university, but for example, a regional commission, a regional entity or authority, which may have research capability. And I should also say that this shouldn't preclude if you're applying, for example, from a United Way or from another community-based organization, that you have your own in-house research capability. I think that that's also sufficient too. I think the most important part is that that ultimately that these interventions provide some that it be rooted in some sort of research methodology, and that it's rigorous enough for us to be able to take findings and to be able to share them with the field.
Thank you. Is it appropriate to focus on a pilot intervention that has a more macro level or systems change focus? I think the answer there is if you can connect that pilot back to outcomes that relate to the outcomes for workers that were on that previous slide that I shared around wages and access to quality jobs or dismantling barriers. I think yes, we would consider that. But it should be, as I mentioned, it should just kind of match the criteria that we define as a pilot, and it should, apply to the outcomes that we lay out in our funding priorities. Another question asks about, what we mean by local research organizations. Is that DC or anywhere in the US? It's anywhere in the US. So while Urban is based in DC, we want to see applications from across the country from research organizations and community practitioners from across the country. Do findings need to be published or publishable? The short answer is yes. And that can be in a variety of formats. It doesn't have to be an academic manuscript or a journal article, but WorkRise is very focused on creating actually public goods for the broader field, not just for the academic community, although we really do encourage that because as one of our leadership board members has pointed to us, is that encourages an extra level of rigor and credibility to it. But we also want to translate those findings and put them in a public setting online and in events and other communications that are actually usable and applicable by the people who are actually carrying out the work, whether they're advocates or policymakers or employers, what have you. So we strongly encourage applications that can address how they would communicate their findings to those audiences. I hope that helps answer your question. Let's see, trying to make sure we use the rest of our time well here. Can we include salaries in the grant requests when they are essential to implementing the interventions or program? I believe the answer is yes, but I will let maybe Bridget weigh in if there's more.
Yeah, your budget should include salaries for the staff that will actually be participating in executing the project. As long as they, yeah, right, as long as they are essential to implementing the intervention, right, or the program.
All right. Oh, and then do you want to say a little bit, Bridget, about indirect cost rates and how those are addressed on a case-by-case basis? Because I know that question comes up a lot.
It does. So our indirect cost rate, Urban in General believes in full cost recovery for a project. We also don't have a cap because we are interested in a wide variety of organizations applying to our RFP. So what may be useful for a university may not be useful for a nonprofit organization or a smaller organization. So just keep that in mind. What we encourage is for you to submit a budget with your organization's indirect cost rate. And then we will assess them in totality with assessing your project in general when we review the budget.
All right. So I believe that is the time that we have today. Todd, I think you have maybe just a few closing words. Before you do that, let me just again encourage you to visit the WorkRise website to view the RFP. And if you have questions, that email address again is workrise@urban.org.
Thank you so much, Caleb, and thank you to Bridget and to the entire WorkRise team for pulling this together. We can't be more excited about what this opportunity has before us. We certainly learned a lot in our grant making process. And through this, we certainly believe that through the types of projects that you're going to propose, that we will be able to have real and meaningful change in the labor market, particularly for those individuals who have been mired in low wage work and employment. So we're excited about hearing your ideas. I just want to reiterate a couple of points that have been made in the past. Most of the information that you'll probably ask or the questions that you may have are already answered through a detailed perusing of the website where we have Q&As and there's quite a bit of detail around the application. And so to the extent that you have challenges or questions about your particular proposal, we certainly are very much interested in receiving that through our WorkRise mailbox. And I think that information has also been shared with you there. And then maybe finally, and I just want to underscore, we've talked about this a lot, is that we're seeking a diversity of applicants. And I think that if you are from a smaller state, if you represent a smaller organization, if you represent one that has not necessarily been traditionally engaged in the research, I don't think that you should exclude yourself because of that. And we're certainly looking for ways to cast a broad tent and continue to meet our project goals for eligibility. So with that, I'll conclude today. Thank you so much for what you have, the time that you spent with us. We hope that this is valuable and we look forward to seeing your project proposal. Thank you.